Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Helfer-Parker, and I'm thrilled to have Gina Ogden back to the show. If you recall, she did one of the first 10 episodes called Exploring Low Female Sexual Desire, and we made sure that we added a part 1 to that title because we wanted to do a part 2. We were not finished with everything we wanted to cover. So I've got her back on the show. I'm so excited to have her. She's an award-winning sex therapist, family therapist, researcher, teacher, author. She has done so many interesting things and has written several books, one in particular called The Return of Desire, another one called The Heart and Soul of Sex. She's got several books out actually for training of therapists around sex therapy as well. So really well-rounded, just kind of a gem in the sex therapy field, and just thrilled to have her here. So welcome back, Gina.
Well, thank you, Natasha. I'm so happy to be back.
Yeah, and we're specifically wanting to have you at this particular time because I know that you're going to be involved in a summit coming up in the Salt Lake City area in September. And so I wanted to make sure that you had an opportunity to market that. We'll talk about that probably a little bit towards the end of the show, but I want to make sure that people are aware that you're going to be in town, at least for some of those of you who are in the Rocky Mountain region. And I think definitely would be worth taking up that opportunity to make sure to see you. And your co-host will also be another well-renowned author, Emily Nagoski, who is the author of Come As You Are.
Yes.
So let's keep talking low desire. This is a common issue that comes up in sex therapy quite a bit, specifically from women. And I think that's the audience that we'll be addressing today for the most part, although some of these concepts obviously are not gender specific. And I think that we especially wanted to cover this question of what gets in the way of sexual desire. Why do we oftentimes find ourselves saying no to sex when in reality we want more sexuality or sexual growth in our own personal lives? And I know that a big part of what you want to talk about today is a spiritual component to that. So I guess I'll just let you start off with how you'd like to frame that.
Yeah, if you could bottle answers to the question that you just asked, you would be a billionaire. But
right.
Moving along, what I have found over the years is from women in particular, but men as well, is that they're saying by the time they get to therapy and realize not everything's okay, what comes out is something like, isn't there supposed to be something more to sex than just ... you fill in the blanks, just intercourse or just stimulation to the moment of orgasm or just whatever it is. And again, over the years, I've created this, what I call a wheel of sexual experience, 4-dimensional wheel of sexual experience, because our sexual experience, low desire, high desire, perfectly matched desire, involves our bodies, our minds, our hearts, and our spirits. And while we can understand the body part, this is about sensation. The emotional part, this is about love and hate and rage and remembering what happened to us in the past sometimes. And we can deal with the mental part, which are some of those messages that we bring into our sexual relationships. Good girls don't, real men score, all of which may present blocks and also openings. People often balk at this quadrant of the wheel called spirituality. And what is this about? And again, I don't have the perfect answer because nobody has the perfect answer. And sages have struggled for eons to come up with the answer. But very briefly, I see spirituality as our personal relationship with the divine, or with a power greater than we are, as distinct from religion, for instance, which is a more mediated relationship about how we're supposed to worship, how we're supposed to relate to the divine. And the divine, by divine, you can call this God or goddess or nature or wolf or tree or whatever is in your belief system. So when we're talking about the subject of sexuality and what is spiritual around sexuality, we're moving beyond science. And I think this is important to say, especially when it comes to the summit in Salt Lake City, because my wonderful co-presenter will be Emily Nagoski, who is a self-styled or self-proclaimed nerd who is talking about neuroscience, the neuroscience of sexual response, and all of which is wonderful and enlightening and necessary to know. And when we begin to talk about spirituality, we're stepping into another realm. We're stepping into a realm of not knowing or not being able to define. For instance, a famous phrase about spirituality is the peace that passeth understanding. So we're talking about the realms of sexuality and intimacy that we can't really categorize. You know, what really attracts us, what lifts us up, what casts us down into despair, because spirituality isn't all love and light. It can also be the depths, the absolute bottom of the hole out of which you have to climb. So when we're talking about spiritual sex, we're talking about how our bodies, minds, hearts come together through our breath, perhaps. If you think about it, the word breath comes from a Latin word spirare, so that the root word of breath is spirit. So there's no one right way to define it. Spirituality is part of our neurological wiring, and it is part of our sexuality as well. And it relates to our personal history. It relates to how we relate to giving and receiving love, touch, energy, and how we process our experience, past, present, and future. So let's kind of begin there, and then we can get into more specifics.
And even before you start there, how would you define what's the difference between what you're talking about and maybe a term that people are starting to hear more, which is tantra or tantric sex? Different, similar?
Yeah, well, Tantra has also been around for many, many, many generations, thousands of years. And Tantra is actually based on Vedic texts, Buddhist texts. And it's a religious observance which brings in the body. So in a way, Tantra is more about religion than it is about spirituality. But I think you can't really talk about spiritual sex without also talking about Tantra, because there are some wonderful parts of Tantra, like eye gazing and certain kinds of breathing and holding energy and holding space that have to do with spirituality. So, in short, Tantra is certainly a form of spiritual sex. It's not the whole thing.
Okay. All right. So, yeah, let's get back to where you'd like to begin, which is, are you saying looking at past, present, future?
Sure. I think that if we're talking about sexual spirituality, we're talking about it as part of the whole picture of our sexual template, if you will. And our sexual template is part of the whole picture of our whole lives. So again, it has to do with the relationship of our bodies, of our sensations, the sensations that we see, feel, hear, taste, touch, etc. It has to do with what we think, with how we conceptualize our sexuality, and it has to do with how we feel. And when we step into that spiritual place, it's a place of connection and it's a place of meaning. It's a place where we can see the large picture. And I realize as we're talking, it's very hard to define because it's beyond definition. There are no hard and fast rules. It's part of what Carl Jung, the transpersonal psychologist, called the quote unquote irrational facts of experience. Meaning that not everything about our sexuality or about our low desire or about our porn use or about our wonderful ecstatic experiences, however we're defining desire, not everything can be boiled down to facts, to data that you can measure, that you can count. So when we're talking about spiritual sex, it has to be like a whole person experience or a sense of knowing rather than something you can count and measure.
Right, because we tend to make a big deal, especially in psychology fields, about using evidence-based approaches, right? Or approaches that would meet some type of criteria that we know they're going to be helpful. At the same time, that has limitations as well, because like you're saying, there are aspects of human experience that are very difficult, if not impossible, to measure. So not everything comes through with electrodes or things of that nature. And I think that's what you're getting at, is there might be something here that is hard to explain or even define, and yet worthwhile exploring, because it, in a sense, can transcend our sexual experience into a realm that's different than what we're currently experiencing.
I think that you've got it. You're very good. And what happens when you get into those irrational, quote unquote, from Jung, kind of realms, is that there can be amazing shifts that again you can't quite understand with your mind or even with your heart, and so can be quite scary even. I'm looking in my book, The Heart and Soul of Sex, and I do a lot of quoting from the women who answered my survey on sexuality and spirituality, and I just opened the book to this one, which is kind of interesting, and it brings us into the past that you mentioned. Here we go. From this 51-year-old abuse survivor. She says, as a child, I used to escape from sexual abuse by disappearing into nature, trees, rocks, the earth, and so forth. This formed the basis for an abiding sense of oneness with all of the earth. So my spirituality was sort of built in as a result of sexual abuse. After years of therapy, she writes, I was able to experience the presence and joy of this union in the union of marriage. It was wonderful to bring it all consciously together. So this is the kind of response that I will be getting from respondents or from people who will step into my wheel of sexual experience, that they will suddenly get something. They'll make a shift or an aha or have a knowing, a sense of connection and meaning that makes their lives and their sexuality make sense. So it's the difference between working on your problem of low sexual desire, like it's a dysfunction, and you can do these many steps and hope to somehow bring back this thing called desire, which, by the way, nobody has ever truly defined, because how can you define desire? How can you define what I want in the large sense? So this is a way of literally stepping in and experiencing in a full body way something that kind of slots into place. And we call it spirituality, partly because it's involved with the breath.
So maybe that's where we could head next, because all of this sounds super lovely and wonderful. Like, I think most people be like, yeah, I want me some of that. At the same time, we do tend to then ask the next question, how do I get that? And to your point, we start making checklists or have certain books we're going to read or certain exercises we're going to take a part of. And sometimes those are helpful, sometimes not so much. And so how do we get to the application of what you're talking about?
So one of the ways, there are numerous ways, and it kind of depends on you which ways work. But one of the things that I will be doing at the summit is kind of surprising people a little bit and asking everybody to bring to the day that I'll be teaching, to bring 2 objects. And one of these objects is to represent a part of their sexual story that they want to keep and expand and grow. And another object will be to represent a part of their sexual story that they want to move on from or release or never have anything to do with again. So right away, we're into one of the big spiritual principles. It's actually a quote unquote hermetic principle of polarity, that nothing is either right or wrong or good or bad, but it's all part of the same energy. And so we will work with these objects. Somebody might bring in, for instance, a ripe mango to represent the juicy sweetness she or he wants to feel with a lover. And might bring in, on the other hand, a black rock or a strip of danger tape to represent how scary it was in childhood. So how are we to resolve or those 2 opposites? We really can't resolve them in any rational way, and sometimes not even in an emotional way. But when we work with them, when we relate them to the wheel, when we explore each of these objects in the physical dimension, in the emotional dimension, feelings around them, in the messages around them, then you can make meaning from them. So this is one of the things that we'll be doing. And if you're listening to this now, think about the kind of objects that you might choose that would represent disparate parts of what you want sexually, and allow your objects to be your teachers. Again, another spiritual principle is that everything has life, so that black rock or strip of danger tape has life. It has a message for you. It can be your teacher. That ripe mango, beautiful piece of juicy fruit, also has life and can be your teacher. And what are the messages that those objects that you have chosen, what are the messages that they have for you around your desire? So it's a very different approach, which is different from sitting in a chair across from somebody and saying, okay, you have low desire. Tell me more about your problem. So it's really stepping into the issue from a whole other perspective and finding not so much answers as ahas or knowings or different paths to follow.
And so as people have done this, I know many times with you, what do you see as some of the results of that processing and finding new meanings to things that we maybe have carried with us for a long time?
Some of the results are that people are able to say yes where they used to say no, because they're opening themselves up to exploring in a whole other way. And for some people, it feels really risky. Instead of just sitting in a chair and waiting for the therapist to ask questions, they're literally standing up, walking around the wheel, embodying the wheel, and allowing their bodies to give some of the answers. Our bodies have enormous intelligence. When we stand in a certain way, or slump in a certain way, or protect ourselves, or open up, these are the kind of stories your body is telling, which have an entirely spiritual element in the sense that they can't always be defined. So I guess what we're saying in terms of spiritual sex is, guess what? You can't define it. And what happens when you step into it, or this is your experience, is that certain kind of, for some people, explosive fireworks happen that they've wanted all their lives, that they experience not so much pleasure or even orgasm as ecstasy, a sense of being able to communicate with themselves, with their partners, with the universe, with whatever they name the divine, God, goddess, etc. And that this is transformative, it's life-changing, and people are never the same again.
And so what if you don't have access to a therapist, for example, that's been Gina trained? And you maybe don't have the opportunity to do this in necessarily a therapeutic or setting like at the summit. I think you'll probably be doing some of this work. How can these principles be applied for somebody to maybe do them in their own home or in their own spaces and therefore still reap some of the benefits of these principles that you're talking about?
I think that's a great question. And I should say, as a therapist, I'm always trying to put myself out of business, because to me, therapy that works is what the client takes home. It's not what the therapist does so much as what the clients take home. So you can certainly read about this approach in my books, or you can read about the approach on my 2 websites. But for many women and men, just being able to reconceptualize sexual experience as a circle with 4 dimensions is mind-blowing. Body, mind, heart, and spirit. So many of us get stuck in the sense that sex is just physical. It's all about physical. We have to take a pill to get an erection, or we have to have pelvic floor therapy if we're tight as a woman, if our vagina is tight, and we end up with a condition called vaginismus. And so many people get caught up in the notion that sex is just about how you think about it. It's just about your attitudes. Are you open to people being gay or lesbian or trans? Or are you closed? Are you locked into, this is how it has to be? Or sex can only be in marriage, in the dark, for the procreation of children, etc. So it's the notion of having a whole person, if you will, a whole person's sexuality, body, mind, heart, and spirit, and the ability to move fluidly among these dimensions of yourself. And if you have a partner, to have your partner move among those dimensions and come together in a multidimensional space. So we're not locked into some kind of, this is the way it has to be done. And if it doesn't work this way, there's something wrong with you or with me. So I'm not, by the way, if whatever you're doing works for you, that is great. I'm not trying to set some kind of new standard. But if you want to try something new, we can begin to break some of the defining barriers to what is real sex, what's right sex, what are the right things we can do, and how we relate to ourselves first and our partners.
And so just to clarify, it's not that you're setting up, like you're saying, some standard where if you get more in tune spiritually with your sexuality, that every single sexual encounter is going to be mind-blowing and firework-inducing. But it's more, I'm hearing, there might be some of that, but there might also be a more acceptance of what is, or this sense of that we can move from a we're broken in some way, either you or I or both of us, to this is an interesting place we're at, and let's see where we go from here.
Yeah, and what does it mean? And I should say there is a risk that you would experience something that's way out there, but you might not experience that every single time. So again, you can't set up that standard for yourself. But I really like your sense of acceptance and noticing what is. So the wheel, it's a template for awareness, and it's based on the medicine wheel, which is a spiritual template for awareness, for stepping into our physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual experience.
I think that's interesting because I agree with you. I think we live, first of all, I think in a very intellectual culture where we talk, and I see this a lot with my clients as I speak with them. We're very much in our heads. We've got to make sense of this. Or we might actually at times get into our feelings, the emotional piece, because those are maybe the 2 realms we're most cognizant of, is what we're thinking and maybe what we're feeling. But the mental piece, which you're talking about, is an interesting one. The messages we maybe have grown up with or have around us in our culture at any given time, which are often very subconscious and are not necessarily on our minds a lot. And then the physical piece is also interesting because we're not a culture, I think, that gets into our physicality, but then when it comes to sex, that's all we think about, right? So are you supposed to touch me here, or am I supposed to touch you in a certain way? And if you look at all the magazines, that's really what they're offering. Here's the 10 best ways to give a blowjob, or here's the 10 best ways to rock your woman's world. And it's very much about doing certain physical acts instead of encompassing, I think, what you're saying, these 4 aspects at the same time at any given time.
Right.
Versus compartmentalizing.
Yeah. And one of the things that I routinely teach and will certainly be teaching in Salt Lake City is how we begin, whether it's sex therapy or whether it's sex, we begin by clearing energy, by finding ways with our breath, and sometimes there are other ways too, to take all that tension and all the shoulds that we're carrying around and the anger from how somebody spoke to us 20 minutes ago, and how to take all of that and simply send it away. Send it down into the earth, down to Pachamama, who can digest it and send it back up, breathe it back up as openness. So a lot of what I'm attempting to teach is how to open yourself to new experience. And new experience might suddenly become how you're processing old experience. Again, that black rock or that yellow piece of danger tape, that awful uncle who was always at family parties and held you too tightly in his lap, etc., which we carry with us even into our most loving relationships, and how we can use our spiritual energy, our breath, our spirare, to clear away those blocks, those memories, those experiences, those pieces of yuck that are stuck in our bodies or in our minds or in our hearts, so that we can be open to ourselves and to our partners, if we have partners. And I'm not suggesting that in order to be sexual, you have to have a partner. So I really want to state that.
Yeah, thank you. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you came upon some of these concepts and verbiage that you use, some of the rituals that I've been to several of your presentations, so I know some of your style.
I listened to my clients, and back in the late 70s, early 80s, when I was starting to work, I was hearing that what my clients were saying and asking for was very different from what I was reading in books. So I started asking questions, what's missing? What's not in here? And very long story short, 2 big things were missing back then. One was women's experience, powerful women's experience. And the other was this thing that my clients were calling spiritual experience. I didn't know what that meant. I had no idea until I ended up doing a survey that went nationwide, and the 3,810 respondents fed back to me this concept of you can't talk about spiritual sex without also talking about the emotions and without talking about the thoughts. So I think I experience physically I feel emotionally and I connect in some way to all of this. And that is what makes sex meaningful. This is really hard to do on the radio. Because it is just not an easy thing for me to speak clearly about. What I will do in Salt Lake City, which is what I do in many of my presentations, is I'll use a drum, the drum beat, the heartbeat of Mother Earth, rhythmic drum beat, which opens up your pineal gland so that you're able to see more with your eyes closed. Okay? That's another kind of spiritual concept that is hard to put into words. But when you do it, oh my God, something huge happens. And you get into the very center of the wheel, which is the place I call the place of, oh God. Because what is it that people cry out in bedrooms across the land? Oh God.
Right.
On the other hand, it's also that place of deep despair. Oh God. Which may be the place of loss of desire or terrible pain, the impetus that brings people into sex therapy in the first place. So I just think we need to respect those irrational facts of experience along with cognitive behavioral therapy and all the other good stuff we know about, like sensate focus. And even when you do sensate focus, there's all this information that comes off an experience like that or an exercise like that that usually is not factored in. So the wheel is my way of trying to factor in all of the stuff that kind of is never quite being dealt with, or often is not being dealt with in therapy, or that people have questions about, they don't even know how to ask the question.
Well, two thoughts. One is that a lot of this talk that you're sharing about polarity and, how there can be, in a sense, two sides of this coin where, oh God, can be a cry for joy and jubilation and passion, and it can also be a despair thing, is very prominent in Mormon doctrine. There's a scripture somewhere that talks about opposition in all things, in the sense that where there is joy, there is the potential for pain, and vice versa. And right. And even our whole creation story, a big part of having to leave the garden was not because God wanted to torture people, but it was this idea that in a state of innocence and well-being, there's no opportunity for growth, and that the opportunity for growth and joy really comes from having hardships and pain. And so that's an interesting way to maybe tie this a little bit into Mormonism, is that all these potential problems or hurts or wounds also have the potential for transformance and transcendence and great things as well.
I love what you're saying. I very often quote from one of my favorite poets, William Blake, whom I met in college many years ago. And he wrote, "Joy and woe are woven fine, a fabric of the soul divine." And if you can't feel the pain, the despair, the woe, you probably can't fully feel the joy either. So in conceptualizing the wheel, this is a safe place that you can step into. You can also step out of it, but you can step into the wheel to explore both the joys and the woes, and back to the joys again. And I do a very specific exercise, which I will not divulge to you now, about moving from yes to no and back to yes again, and how we can, this is an embodied kind of exercise. It's one of the stories our body tells, and we can learn ways to recognize when we're in that no place where we're really shut down, or maybe in that very yes place. I gotta have this. I gotta do porn. I gotta have more, more, more. I'm never satisfied. And how we can move back and forth between these two states in our sexuality, in our lives, and how we can relate this physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. It is so not rocket science. It is so not science. And yet, oddly, as I'm finding all of the neuroscience that's coming out, all of the neuroscience is affirming this, that you need to differentiate before you can integrate experience. That there's something called polyvagal theory, where the flight fight kind of response versus a more socialized accepting response. So this may not be, with quotes around it, evidence-based, but there's a lot of evidence that is very affirming to this work that we can do individually and collectively around parts of our sexual stories that are not quite working for us. And low desire being one of them.
Yeah, so then my second thought is anytime, this is just showing my own personal biases here, so anytime people start beating on drums and talking spirituality, even though I come from, my own religious background, there's something about my mental health personage that just shuts down. And I'm like, okay, this is not for me. And yet I've gone to your presentations at several of these conferences, and I will have an experience, right? I will force myself to go to your conference, and I will force myself to listen to your drum, and I've got this whole eye rolling thing going on, and then I'm crying, and then I'm having a moment, and then I'm talking to my colleague like, this is so interesting and funny that this is what I do every time I go see Gina. So I just want to second that even for those of us who are skeptics or, maybe don't totally understand what you're talking about, that there is something very experiential about spending time with you and having an experience that does shift something, and that there's movement. And I think that maybe that's your point, is that it doesn't have to be all encompassing, but that movement makes us go to new places. And that's exciting.
Yeah, and can be scary and can be wonderful. And I love your confessional moment here. And I think that the point that wonderful Kristen Hodson, who was hosting the entire 2 days, I think the point that she is making is that there's sexual science, which we can really clock and understand with our minds, and it makes so much sense. And Emily Nagoski just brings that to life in such a special way. But there is something more too, and to be able to, for me, the huge cookie here is to, first of all, be able to enjoy Emily for a whole day and just soak up what she is saying and doing, and how she's relating to us, and to be able to take that and put all of what she's saying into the wheel, to build that bridge so that people can bring the science, bring everything that they know and want to know into the wheel, and then take it, as you say, to that maybe kicking and screaming, to that new place themselves.
Right. And I come back, like I've gone to your thing several times. So maybe one last question before I turn over the time that you want to talk about the summit more in depth. As far as, again, making this applicable, let's say you're in your bedroom, your sexuality is being initiated by your partner, whom, let's just say, you love and are attached to, and your body is just not in that space where you want it to be. What are some ways in those moments that what you're talking about can come into play?
Well, first of all, recognizing it and being able to recognize it at a level that is not, oh my God, there's something wrong with me. But all right, my body isn't here. What can I do? Maybe I need to get up and exercise. Maybe we need to shower together or do the proverbial bubble bath. Maybe I can use my mind to remind my body to be in that place of yes instead of that place of no, which is something that we will be literally practicing. Maybe there's a conversation I can be having with my partner because I'm not blaming myself for being in this place of turned off. That means I can converse. I mean, I could tick off a number of things to do, but I think basically it's being able to recognize, to locate where you are on the wheel. Am I in my body? Am I in my mind? Running through all the things I have to do and all the emails I need to answer. Am I in my emotions, being pissed off at Uncle Frank or at my partner? Where am I? And once you know where you are and have learned how you can move back and forth, then you have some kind of fluidity. You're not stuck. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that piece of figuring out how to stop the either self-blame or the partner blame, I think those are very easy places to go, right? There's something wrong with me, or there's something wrong with my partner, they're not doing something right, or there's something wrong with our relationship, right? So we tend to demonize these things that are not necessarily true at all, and you're offering such a healthier perspective of where are these different components of myself and how do I show up in ways, or why am I not showing up, and being non-judgmental to yourself and to your relationship and to your partner in that process.
Yeah, or at least knowing when you are being judgmental, and then you make a joke,
right?
If you want. Or I also teach exorcisms. It's like throwing Uncle Frank or judgmental grandma out of the bedroom.
Yeah.
Before you begin banging the pots and pans and doing a good old-fashioned exorcism so that you clear the space for you and your partner.
And just so nobody freaks out, because that can be a loaded word, but I think what Gina is talking about here, which is so powerful, and sometimes we don't recognize the power of ritual, and doing something symbolic can really, again, move that space forward, which is why the beating of the drum or the beating of the pots or writing a letter and burning it, or whatever rituals that we can come up with and be creative about, can be extremely helpful.
Thank you for calling me on the potential loadedness and scariness of ritual. We could do a whole other podcast just on that. But ritual is not only symbolic. Ritual involves the body. It involves thought. It involves emotion. It involves meaning. So really, you're bringing yourself back into the whole circle, whether you're burning a letter or banging a pot or taking a bubble bath with your sweetie.
Well, awesome. I think that's great. I think that's a good. Is there anything else you're wanting to make sure you cover about spirituality that I haven't asked you about before we move more directly into the summit?
I think we should just move to the summit.
Okay.
I think everyone listening, I hope you can come to the summit.
Yeah, it'll be, I think, a really unique opportunity to take advantage of. I don't know that Gina and Emily will ever be in Salt Lake City together at the same time again. So it really is a unique opportunity. So tell us more about it. What are you preparing? What can people expect? I think there was a conception that maybe it was made for mental health professionals, but that isn't necessarily the case, even though there's going to be continuing education available for mental health professionals. This is also very much open to the public. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I cannot speak for Emily, but I think she would agree with me that there will be plenty here for, if you're a practitioner of any kind, if you work with people around their sexuality, or even don't work with people but not around their sexuality, because you're going to learn a lot about sexuality between the two of us and between everybody who's going to be there. One of the things I love about having a core of professionals in the room is that they can hold very safe space for what is going to be happening. And my hope is that at least half of the people there will not be mental health professionals, because you who are not mental health professionals will keep those of us who are honest and keep us away from speaking in jargon and keep us focused on what is experienced. And when I teach the wheel, I invariably have a whole spectrum of people there. And we dive into experience, and at certain moments, I'll kind of step out and give a little synopsis for address to the mental health people. This is an example of blah, blah. This is what you just saw. And this usually works very, very nicely.
And it's a 2-day event, is that correct?
It's a day with Emily from, I think, 9 to 4, followed by a day with me from 9 to 4. So you have the science of sexuality, you have the spirituality of sexuality, and then there's a bunch of really cool stuff before and after, which are book signings, which is always fun because I get to meet people one-on-one. But also, I think there's art projects. There's somebody who's going to be teaching belly dancing. There's going to be raffles. There's going to be benefits for the local LGBT group. Go to the website.
Yes, which I will link to and give all that information as well. So it is going to be, I think, a really great event, and encourage people to attend if they can. Well, great. I'm super excited for you, and I can't thank you again for coming back on. I know your time is super valuable, and I'm just glad to have been able to finish out our discussion, because I know we didn't get to all the points we wanted to in the last interview.
Well, I'm delighted to know you, Natasha, and so glad that you're doing these podcasts. Really important, getting information out.
Well, thank you. That's very meaningful. And you have a good evening.
You too. Thank you.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles. And as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
It's been a a trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary.